The scent of freshly cut grass and the sweet perfume of late summer roses hung heavy in the air on that August afternoon in 1999. In the sleepy town of Oak Haven, Oregon, life moved at a gentle, predictable pace, dictated by the changing seasons. For the Miller family, it was a day like any other, filled with the simple joys of childhood. 8-year-old Ethan, with his boundless energy and a smile that could charm the birds from the trees, was the heart of their world. His laughter, a melodic peal that echoed through their small blue house, was the soundtrack to their lives. On this particular day, that sound was punctuated by the rhythmic counting of his older sister, Chloe. "Ready or not, here I come." Chloe's voice, full of the mock-serious tone only a 10-year-old can muster, sliced through the tranquil afternoon. She squeezed her eyes shut one last time, the rough bark of the ancient oak tree pressing against her cheek. This was their ritual, an after-school game of hide-and-seek that often stretched until their mother's call for dinner. Ethan, smaller and quicker, was a master of concealment, his slight frame disappearing into the familiar landscape of their sprawling backyard. Chloe cherished these moments, the thrill of the hunt and the inevitable triumphant discovery of her giggling brother. She began her search in the usual spots, behind the overgrown lilac bushes, inside the rickety old shed that smelled of damp, earth and forgotten tools, and even under the sagging porch steps. Each empty hiding place only fueled her determination. "Ethan, I'm going to find you," she called out, her voice laced with playful confidence. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, dancing shadows across the lawn. The familiar chirping of crickets started to replace the daytime sounds, a subtle shift in the day's symphony that usually signaled the end of their game. A half-hour bled into an hour, and the playful nature of the search began to curdle into a knot of anxiety in Chloe's stomach. The sky, now a canvas of deep oranges and purples, seemed to mock her. Growing unease, she called his name again, the playful lilt gone, replaced by a tremor of fear. The silence that answered was heavy, unnatural. The familiar comfort of their backyard, a place of endless adventures, now felt vast and menacing. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. Their mother, Sarah, stepped onto the back porch, a dish towel in her hands and a gentle smile on her face. "Chloe, Ethan, time for dinner," she called out, her voice warm and comforting. But her smile faltered when she saw the look on Chloe's face. The raw, burgeoning panic in her daughter's eyes was a stark contrast to the peaceful evening. "I can't find him, Mum," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's really good at hiding, but ... it's been too long." The casual dismissal that rose to Sarah's lips died before it could be spoken. A mother's intuition, that primal, unexplainable sense of knowing, sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. She scanned the yard, her gaze darting from the darkened corners to the dense woods that bordered their property. The familiar landscape suddenly felt alien, a place where a small boy could simply vanish. The scent of roses was now cloying, the beauty of the sunset obscene in the face of this new, terrifying reality. The next few hours were a blur of frantic searching and escalating panic. Their father, Mark, arrived home from his construction job to a scene of controlled chaos. Neighbors, drawn by Sarah's increasingly desperate calls for Ethan, fanned out with flashlights, their beams cutting through the deepening twilight. The Oak Haven police were called, and soon the quiet suburban street was filled with the flashing lights of patrol cars, a jarring intrusion into their peaceful world. The sense of community, once a source of comfort, now felt like a spotlight on their private nightmare. Chloe, wrapped in a blanket on the living room sofa, watched the proceedings with wide, unblinking eyes. The questions from the uniformed officers were a confusing jumble of words. "Where did you last see him? Did you see any cars you didn't recognize? Did he ever wander off before?" She answered in a small, trembling voice, the memory of her brother's mischievous grin as he ran to hide now a torturous image. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her small shoulders. It was just a game. He was supposed to be found. As night fully enveloped Oak Haven, a different kind of chill set in. The initial adrenaline gave way to a cold, hard dread. The search parties grew larger, their lights bobbing like fireflies in the dark woods. The sounds of the night, once a comforting lullaby, were now filled with menace. Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a fresh wave of fear through the Miller house. The game was over, But the nightmare had just begun. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness, each one a fresh wave of despair. The hope that Ethan would be found, cold and scared but safe, began to fray at the edges. By the time the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky, a grim reality had settled over the Miller family and the small town of Oak Haven. 8-year-old Ethan Miller, a boy with a sunshine smile and a love for hide-and-seek, had vanished, without a trace. The silence he left behind was a deafening roar that would echo for years to come. The first 24 hours after Ethan's disappearance were a maelstrom of organized chaos and raw, unfiltered emotion. The Oak Haven Police Department, unaccustomed to such cases, quickly called in state resources. Seasoned search and rescue teams, with their determined-looking dogs and high-tech equipment, descended on the Millers' quiet street. A command post was established at the end of the cul-de-sac, a stark, official presence in the heart of their suburban dream. The air, once filled with the sounds of children's laughter, now buzzed with the crackle of radios and the clipped, professional tones of law enforcement. Detective David Rourke, a veteran of the Oregon State Police with 2 decades of experience, was assigned as the lead investigator. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of past cases, some solved, some hauntingly open. He walked the perimeter of the Millers' property, his gaze missing nothing. He noted the worn path leading into the dense woods that bordered their backyard, a forest that stretched for miles, a vast, untamed wilderness. He could feel the weight of the family's hope and the crushing pressure of the ticking clock. The woods themselves became the primary focus of the search. The terrain was challenging, a tangle of undergrowth, towering Douglas firs, and hidden ravines. The scent of pine and damp earth was thick, a primal smell that seemed to swallow sound. Searchers, a mix of trained professionals and civilian volunteers, moved in grid patterns, their brightly colored vests a stark contrast to the deep greens and browns of the forest. They called Ethan's name until their voices were raw, the sound absorbed by the dense canopy above. For Sarah and Mark Miller, the world had shrunk to the 4 walls of their living room. They sat in a state of suspended animation, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall a cruel reminder of the passing time. Friends and neighbors brought food that went untouched, offered words of comfort that couldn't penetrate the fog of their grief. Every phone call made their hearts leap, only to plummet back into the abyss of despair when it wasn't the news they so desperately craved. The silence in the house was a physical presence, a constant, agonizing reminder of Ethan's absence. Chloe, in her own world of silent suffering, replayed the last moments of the game over and over in her mind. Had she counted too long? Had he found a new, secret hiding place she didn't know about? She remembered a fleeting glimpse of a red t-shirt, the one he was wearing, near the edge of the woods. "I think he went into the woods," she told Detective Rourke, her voice small and uncertain. "He was never supposed to go in there alone. We have a rule." This small detail, a child's memory, would shape the course of the investigation for years. Search dogs, with their superior sense of smell, provided the first and only tangible clue. They tracked Ethan's scent from the old oak tree, across the lawn, and to the very edge of the woods. But there, at the threshold of the forest, the trail went cold. It was as if he had simply been lifted from the earth, plucked from existence. At the place where the manicured lawn met the wild, untamed wilderness, the handlers exchanged grim, knowing glances. This was not a good sign. Days turned into a week, and the massive search effort began to scale back. The television news crews, once a constant presence on their street, packed up their cameras and moved on to the next tragedy. The army of volunteers dwindled, returning to their own lives, their own children. The flashing lights and the sense of urgency were replaced by a quiet, gnawing emptiness. The command post was dismantled, leaving behind only the flattened grass, and the lingering feeling of a battle lost. Detective Rourke, however, did not give up. He delved into the Miller family's life, searching for anything that might point to a different explanation than a lost child. He interviewed family, friends, and neighbors, looking for any sign of trouble, any disgruntled acquaintance, any strange vehicles in the area. But the Millers were what they appeared to be, a happy, loving family with no known enemies. The lack of any evidence of foul play was, in its own way, as maddening as the silence from the woods. The community of Oak Haven, though the official search was over, did not forget. Yellow ribbons, a symbol of hope for the missing, appeared on every tree and lamppost. Flyers with Ethan's smiling face, his eyes full of life, were taped to the windows of every shop and gas station. His face became a silent, ubiquitous presence in the town, a constant reminder of the little boy who had vanished into thin air while playing a simple childhood game. For the Miller family, the end of the search was not an end to their torment. It was the beginning of a new, terrible chapter. Life without Ethan. The silent woods behind their home became a place of profound dread, a constant, looming symbol of their loss. They could no longer look at the ancient oak tree without seeing Chloe's small form pressed against it, her eyes squeezed shut, counting down the last happy moments of their lives. The forest held its secrets, and the silence was its answer. First year after Ethan's disappearance was a landscape of grief, a desolate, unchanging terrain of sorrow. The seasons turned, but for the Miller family, time was frozen on that late August afternoon. The yellow ribbons that had once been a symbol of hope began to fade and fray, their cheerful color a mocking reminder of their unanswered prayers. The flyers with Ethan's face grew weathered and torn, his smiling image slowly being reclaimed by the elements. Oakhaven, while not forgetting, began to heal. The raw wound of Ethan's loss slowly scarring over for everyone but those who loved him most. Sarah and Mark found themselves drifting apart, each trapped in their own private ocean of grief. Sarah became a wraith in her own home, cleaning and recleaning Ethan's room as if preparing for his imminent return. She would sit for hours on his bed, his favorite stuffed dinosaur clutched in her hands, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of her son. Mark, on the other hand, threw himself into his work, seeking refuge in the physical exhaustion of long hours and hard labor. The silence between them was a chasm, filled with unspoken accusations and shared unbearable pain. Chloe, now on the cusp of adolescence, carried a burden far too heavy for her young shoulders. The guilt she felt was a constant companion, a whisper in her ear that told her she was to blame. At school, she was the girl whose brother disappeared, a label that set her apart, that made other children look at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She built walls around herself, her once bright personality dimming under the weight of her family's tragedy. She no longer played in the backyard, and the sight of the woods filled her with a nameless terror. Detective Rourke kept the case file for Ethan Miller on the corner of his desk, a constant, tangible reminder of his failure to find answers. He would periodically re-interview the Millers, hoping that the passage of time might have dislodged a forgotten memory, a seemingly insignificant detail. "Are you sure you didn't see anything, Chloe?" he would ask gently, his voice full of a weary kindness. "A car, a person, anything at all?" But her answer was always the same, a tearful, whispered, "No, I just closed my eyes and counted." The one-year anniversary of Ethan's disappearance brought a brief resurgence of media attention. A local news station ran a segment on the case, replaying old footage of the search and showing age-progressed photos of what Ethan might look like at 9 years old. For a few days, the phones at the Oakhaven Police Department rang with supposed sightings and psychic visions, each lead a cruel flicker of hope that was quickly extinguished. It was a painful, public reopening of a wound that had never begun to heal. Mark and Sarah, in a rare moment of unity, organized a candlelight vigil at the local park. Hundreds of people from Oakhaven and surrounding towns attended, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the candles. They shared stories of Ethan, of his infectious laugh and his kind heart. For a few hours, the Millers were not alone in their grief, but as the last candle was extinguished and the crowd dispersed, they were left once again with the stark, cold reality of their loss. The shared moment of community, while comforting, could not fill the void Ethan had left behind. As the years stretched on, the case of the missing boy from Oakhaven slowly faded from public consciousness, becoming another sad story, another unsolved mystery. The yellow ribbons disappeared completely. The flyers were replaced by newer, more immediate concerns. The world moved on, as it always does. But for the Miller family, there was no moving on. They were living in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn, unable to hope, trapped in the amber of that terrible day. Chloe, now a teenager navigating the treacherous waters of high school, found a semblance of normalcy. She made friends, went to parties, and even had a first boyfriend. But the shadow of her brother's disappearance was always there, a part of her that she could never share, never explain. She had nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams of the woods and a faceless, man leading a small boy with a red t-shirt away. She never told her parents about the dreams, not wanting to add to their already unbearable pain. Detective Rourke eventually retired. The Ethan Miller case file passed on to a new, younger detective who had been a child himself when Ethan vanished. Rourke visited the Millers one last time before he left, his face etched with a deep personal regret. "I'm sorry," he said, the words heavy with the weight of years of fruitless searching. "I truly am." Sarah simply nodded, her eyes vacant, while Mark shook his hand with a sense of weary resignation. They had stopped expecting answers long ago. 20 years after Ethan disappeared, the Miller house was quiet. Chloe had long since moved away, creating a life for herself in a bustling city hundreds of miles away, a place with no silent, menacing woods. Sarah and Mark remained, two ghosts haunting the rooms where their children had once played. The hope that had once been a burning fire was now a pile of cold, dead ashes. They had accepted, in their own way, that they would never know what happened to their son. The not knowing was a unique form of torture, a wound that would never close, a question that would echo in their hearts for the rest of their lives. 22 years is a lifetime. It's long enough for a child to grow into an adult, for wounds to scar over, for memories to soften at the edges. In Oakhaven, a new generation had been born and raised, many of whom only knew the story of the Miller boy as a local ghost story, a cautionary tale told to keep children from wandering into the woods. The case of Ethan Miller had officially been declared cold, the thick file box gathering dust in the archives of the Oakhaven Police Department, a silent testament to a family's enduring tragedy. Chloe, now 32, was a successful architect living in Seattle. She had built a life for herself, a life of clean lines and solid foundations, a stark contrast to the fractured, uncertain world of her childhood. She rarely returned to Oakhaven, the town, a museum of her pain. She was engaged to be married, and in the process of planning her future, the past felt more distant than ever. Yet, the ghost of her brother still lingered, a quiet, unseen presence in the architecture of her life. One crisp autumn afternoon, while sorting through a box of old family photos for a wedding slideshow, Chloe stumbled upon a picture of her and Ethan. They were sitting on the front steps of their Oakhaven home. Ethan, with a gap-toothed grin, his arms slung around her shoulders. A wave of grief, as sharp and sudden as it had been 2 decades ago, washed over her. It was a physical ache, a deep, primal longing for the brother she had lost. On impulse, she picked up her laptop and typed his name into a search engine, a ritual she hadn't performed in years. The search results were the same as always: old news articles, a page on a missing children's website, a few blog posts from amateur sleuths. It was a digital graveyard of a life that never was. But then, something new caught her eye. It was a recent post on a genealogy forum, a place where people searched for lost relatives and built family trees. The post was from a young man in Philadelphia, looking for information about his birth parents. His name was Daniel, and he had been adopted as a toddler. The post itself wasn't remarkable. There were hundreds like it. But what made Chloe's breath catch in her throat was the photo attached. It was a grainy, low-resolution picture of a young man with a kind, open face. It was the eyes that captivated her. They were a familiar shade of hazel, a shade she saw in her own reflection every morning. And there was something in his smile, a faint echo of the gap-toothed grin from the photograph in her hands, that sent a jolt through her system. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as a coincidence, a desperate projection of her own longing. Philadelphia was a world away from Oakhaven. The man in the photo, Daniel, would be a few years younger than Ethan. The timelines didn't seem to match, and yet, she couldn't shake the image from her mind. The resemblance was uncanny, ghost of a face she knew better than her own. With trembling hands, she sent a private message to the young man, a simple, hesitant inquiry. "I know this is a long shot," she wrote, "but your story and your photo struck a chord with me. Can you tell me more about your adoption?" Thousands of miles away, in a small apartment in Philadelphia, Daniel Jordan received the message. He was used to getting responses to his post, most of them well-meaning, but ultimately fruitless leads, from people who thought he might be their long-lost cousin or nephew. He was a kind, thoughtful young man, a social worker who dedicated his life to helping at-risk youth. He had a good life, loving adoptive parents, but the question of his origins was a hole in the center of his identity that he had always longed to fill. He read Chloe's message with a familiar mix of hope and skepticism. He had been found, he was told, abandoned as a toddler in a church in Camden, New Jersey, just across the river from Philadelphia. He had no memory of his life before his adoption. The authorities at the time had been unable to identify him or locate his parents. He was a John Doe, a little boy with no name and no past. He replied to Chloe, sharing the few, sparse details he knew about his own history. The exchange of messages continued over the next few days, a tentative, careful dance of hope and disbelief. Chloe shared the story of Ethan's disappearance, the painful details of the game of hide-and-seek, and the silent, menacing woods. Daniel, in turn, shared the emptiness of not knowing, the feeling of being untethered, of having no roots. They were two strangers, separated by a continent and a lifetime of different experiences, yet they were connected by a shared sense of loss. The turning point came when Chloe, her heart pounding in her chest, sent Daniel a photo of Ethan, taken just a few weeks before he disappeared. The response from Philadelphia was almost instantaneous. "Oh my God," Daniel wrote, his words a torrent of shock and emotion. "I have a scar, a small, crescent-shaped scar, above my right eyebrow. I've had it as long as I can remember. My parents were told I had it when I was found. In the photo you sent me, ... Ethan has that same scar." For the first time in 22 years, the cold, dead ashes of hope began to stir, a single, tiny ember glowing in the darkness. The discovery of the matching scar ignited a firestorm of emotion and activity. The faint echo of hope had become a deafening roar, a possibility so profound it was almost too terrifying to contemplate. Chloe immediately called her parents, her voice a mixture of excitement and caution, trying to prepare them for a revelation that could either be the answer to their prayers or another cruel twist of fate. Sarah and Mark listened in stunned silence, the news a seismic shock to the quiet, grief-stricken world they had inhabited for over 2 decades. The idea that Ethan might be alive, that he might be a man named Daniel living across the country, was almost too much to process. Daniel, on his end, was reeling. The life he had known, the identity he had built, was suddenly thrown into question. He looked at the photograph of Ethan Miller, at the little boy with his own eyes and his own scar, and felt a sense of recognition that was both deeply unsettling and profoundly moving. His adoptive parents, the Jordans, were equally shocked, but immediately supportive, their love for their son unwavering. They had always known this day might come, the day his past might come knocking on their door. The next logical step was a DNA test. It was the only way to know for sure, to bridge the gap between uncanny resemblance and biological certainty. Chloe, with the help of a private investigator she hired, arranged for a home DNA kit to be sent to Daniel in Philadelphia and another to her parents in Oakhaven. The waiting period for the results, a matter of a few weeks, felt like an eternity, a stretch of time filled with a potent cocktail of hope, anxiety, and a deep-seated fear of disappointment. During this time, Chloe and Daniel spoke on the phone for hours, sharing the stories of their lives. Chloe described the idyllic childhood they had shared before the disappearance, the feel of the sun on their faces as they played in the backyard, the sound of their mother's laughter. Daniel spoke of his loving upbringing in Philadelphia, his passion for his work, his dreams for the future. They were strangers, and yet they spoke with the easy intimacy of siblings, discovering in each other a shared sense of humor, a similar way of seeing the world. The private investigator, a retired detective named Frank Morrison, began to dig into the circumstances of Daniel's discovery as a toddler. He traveled to Camden, New Jersey, and pulled the old police reports, the found child case file from 1999. The details were sparse. A toddler, estimated to be around 3 or 4 years old, was found sleeping in a pew at St. Michael's Church by the janitor early one morning. He was clean, well-fed, and unharmed, but he spoke very little and seemed disoriented. He was wearing a new-looking set of clothes, not the red t-shirt Ethan had been wearing when he vanished. Frank's investigation hit a wall. The police at the time had done their due diligence, checking missing children's databases, but for some reason, the connection to the boy who had disappeared from Oregon was never made. The physical distance was a major factor, as was the lack of any identifying information with the child. The case had gone cold, and the boy, given the name Daniel, had been placed in the foster care system before being adopted by the Jordans. It was a tragic series of bureaucratic near misses and geographical disconnects. As Frank dug deeper, he uncovered a detail that had been overlooked at the time. The janitor who found the boy, an elderly man named Arthur Jenkins, had mentioned to the police that the church's side door, which was usually locked, had been propped open with a hymn book. It was a small detail, but it suggested that someone had intentionally left the boy there, that he hadn't just wandered in on his own. Arthur Jenkins had passed away a decade ago, a dead end that added to the growing mystery. Meanwhile, in Oakhaven, the news had begun to spread. The local paper got wind of the story, and once again, the Miller family found themselves in the spotlight. This time, however, it was not a story of tragic loss, but one of tentative, incredible hope. The town held its collective breath. Story of the lost boy and the man who might be him, a modern-day fairy tale that everyone wanted to believe in. The renewed attention was overwhelming for Sarah and Mark, but it was a burden they were willing to bear. The day the DNA results were ready, Chloe, her parents, and Daniel all agreed to be on a video call together. The lab sent the results in, a password-protected email to Chloe. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she typed in the password. The screen loaded, and there, in stark black and white, was the answer they had been waiting for. The report confirmed a 99.99% probability that Daniel Jordan was the biological son of Sarah and Mark Miller. Asterisk, a wave of raw, unrestrained emotion erupted on the video call. Sarah sobbed openly, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes fixed on the face of the man who was her son. Mark, his face a mask of disbelief, wept silently, the tears he had held back for 22 years finally falling freely. And Daniel, his own eyes filled with tears, simply whispered, "Mom, Dad." The lie that had defined their lives for so long had been shattered, and in its place was a truth so powerful, so overwhelming, it would change everything. Confirmation that Daniel was indeed Ethan Miller was not an end, but a beginning. It was the start of a new, complex chapter, one filled with the daunting task of piecing together a life that had been stolen and a family that had been broken. The joyful reunion was tempered by a dark, looming question. What happened in the 22 years that separated a game of hide-and-seek in Oregon from a life in Philadelphia? And more importantly, who was responsible for the chasm of silence and lost time? The story of Ethan's reappearance made national news. It was a feel-good story, a miracle in a world that had grown cynical. But for the Miller family and for Ethan, it was far more complicated. The first face-to-face meeting was arranged to take place in a neutral, private setting, away from the prying eyes of the media. Chloe flew to Philadelphia, and her parents, their faces a mixture of joy and apprehension, followed a day later. The anticipation was a physical weight, a heavy, palpable thing that filled the air. The moment Sarah and Mark Miller walked into the room and saw their son, a grown man with their own eyes, time seemed to collapse. Sarah rushed forward, her arms wrapping around Ethan in a hug that was 22 years in the making. She touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar above his eye, a landmark of a life she had missed. "My boy," she whispered. The words, a prayer, a lament, a declaration of love. Mark, a man of few emotions, simply held his son's hand, his grip a silent testament to a father's enduring love. Asterisk, Ethan, for his part, was overwhelmed. He was meeting his family for the first time, a family he had no memory of. He felt a deep, instinctual connection, a sense of coming home to a place he had never known. But there was also a profound sense of dislocation, of being a stranger in his own life story. He was Daniel Jordan, the social worker from Philadelphia, and he was also Ethan Miller, the lost boy from Oakhaven. Reconciling these two identities would be the journey of a lifetime. As the initial euphoria of the reunion began to settle, the focus shifted to the mystery of his disappearance. Frank Morrison, the private investigator, redoubled his efforts, now armed with the knowledge that Ethan had not been a victim of a random, violent crime, but had been taken and deliberately left in a place where he would be found. This suggested a different kind of perpetrator, someone with a motive that was more personal, more complex than simple malice. The investigation led Frank back to Oakhaven, back to the days and weeks following Ethan's disappearance. He meticulously reviewed the original case files, looking for anything that might have been missed, any name that might have been overlooked. He began to focus on the people on the periphery of the Miller family's life, the neighbors, the distant relatives, the friends of friends. Someone had to have known something. Someone had to have seen something. His search led him to a name that had appeared only briefly in the original police reports, a woman named Barbara Clark. She was a distant cousin of Sarah's, a woman who had lived a troubled, transient life. She had attended a family barbecue at the Miller house a few weeks before Ethan disappeared. The police had spoken to her briefly at the time, but she had a solid alibi for the day of the disappearance, claiming she was at a job interview several towns away. The lead had been dismissed. Frank discovered that Barbara Clark had died of a drug overdose 5 years after Ethan vanished. She had lived a life of poverty and addiction, a sad, lonely existence. But as he dug deeper into her past, he found a connection that sent a chill down his spine. In the late 1990s, just before Ethan's disappearance, Barbara had been living in a small town in New Jersey, not far from Camden, where Ethan was found. She had moved to Oregon shortly before the Miller's barbecue and moved back to the East Coast shortly after. The theory began to form, a ghost of a truth emerging from the shadows of the past. Could Barbara, a woman with a history of mental instability and a tenuous connection to the family, have taken Ethan? The motive was unclear. Was it a misguided attempt to rescue him from a life she envied? Was it an act of malice, a way to inflict pain on a family she felt had slighted her? Or was it something else entirely, a secret she had taken to her grave? Armed with this new, explosive theory, Frank and the Millers faced a difficult choice. To pursue this line of inquiry would be to dig up old ghosts, to potentially uncover a betrayal from within their own family. The truth, they were beginning to realize, might be more painful than the not knowing. The happy reunion was now tinged with a new, unsettling mystery, and the ghost of the truth was beginning to reveal a face that was both familiar and terrifying. The revelation of Barbara Clark's potential involvement sent a shockwave through the Miller family. Sarah, in particular, was devastated. She remembered Barbara as a troubled soul, a cousin she had tried to help over the years, but she could never have imagined her capable of such a cruel and calculated act. The idea that a member of her own family could be responsible for 22 years of unimaginable pain was a betrayal of the deepest kind. It forced her to re-examine her memories, to look for signs she might have missed. Frank Morrison advised them to proceed with caution. Barbara was gone, and without a confession, their theory was just that, a theory. But he had a hunch. He believed that a person who would go to the trouble of taking a child across the country and leaving him to be found, rather than harming him, might be a person who was deeply conflicted. A person like that, he reasoned, might have left something behind, a record of their actions, a confession. He learned that Barbara had died in a small, rented house in a rundown neighborhood of Trenton, New Jersey. Her few belongings had been put into storage by her landlord and, after years of unpaid fees, had been auctioned off. The trail seemed to go cold once again, but Frank was persistent. He managed to track down the name of the company that had handled the auction, a long shot, but the only one they had. Miraculously, the auction house, a small, family-run business, kept meticulous, if archaic, records. They were able to identify the buyer of Barbara Clark's personal effects, a local antique dealer who had bought the lot for a pittance, mostly for the old trunk it contained. The dealer vaguely remembered the purchase, recalling the contents as mostly junk, old clothes, books, and letters. He had sold the trunk, but still had a few boxes of the less valuable items stored in the dusty attic of his shop. Frank, along with Ethan and Chloe, traveled to Trenton, a strange pilgrimage to the final, lonely resting place of the woman who may have stolen their lives. The antique dealer, a gruff but ultimately helpful man, led them up a creaky staircase to the attic. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, the only light coming from a single grime-covered window. In a forgotten corner, under a pile of old canvases, were 2 cardboard boxes, with Clark scrawled on the side in faded marker. With a sense of both dread and anticipation, they opened the boxes. Inside was a collection of a life's forgotten detritus, faded photographs, old paperback novels, a handful of cheap souvenirs. It seemed like another dead end. But then, at the very bottom of the second box, under a pile of yellowed newspapers, Chloe found a small, leather-bound journal. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. The handwriting was a spidery, almost illegible scrawl, the pages filled with the ramblings of a troubled mind. As they carefully read through the journal, a story began to emerge, a narrative of jealousy, delusion, and a twisted kind of love. Barbara wrote of her resentment for Sarah's perfect life, her beautiful home, her happy family. She had convinced herself that the Millers were not fit to raise such a special child, that Ethan was destined for something greater. In her delusional state, she saw herself as his savior, the one who would rescue him from a life of suburban mediocrity. The journal detailed her meticulous planning. She had watched the family for weeks, learning their routines. She knew about the game of hide-and-seek. On that August afternoon, she had waited at the edge of the woods, and when Ethan had run to hide near the trees, she had simply taken his hand and led him away. He had gone with her without a fuss, a trusting child with no reason to fear a familiar face. She wrote of the long cross-country bus ride, of how she had told him they were going on a grand adventure. In the final chilling entries, written just before her death, Barbara expressed a kind of remorse, a recognition of the pain she had caused. She wrote that she had left him in the church because she wanted him to be found, to be raised by a good, God-fearing family, something she felt she could never provide. She had followed his progress from a distance for a few years, learning of his adoption by the Jordans, and in her own twisted way, she felt she had done the right thing. The journal was her confession, a final, desperate attempt to explain an act that was, at its core, inexplicable. The silence in the dusty attic was profound. They had found the truth, but it was a truth that offered no easy comfort. It was a story of mental illness, of a quiet, desperate act that had splintered their family and stolen a childhood. The ghost of the truth now had a name and a face, and the story of what happened to Ethan Miller was no longer a mystery, but the knowledge of why it happened was a burden. They would have to learn to carry. The discovery of Barbara's journal was a cataclysmic event, a final, definitive answer to the question that had haunted them for 2 decades. The knowledge that Ethan's disappearance was not the act of a monstrous stranger, but a deeply troubled family member, was a complex and bitter pill to swallow. There was no one to punish, no villain to rail against, only the sad, pathetic story of a woman whose own life was a tragedy. This realization shifted the ground beneath them, forcing them to move from a place of mystery and fear to one of complex grief and a difficult, uncertain path toward healing. For Ethan, the journal was both a key and a curse. It unlocked the door to his past, explaining the inexplicable, but it did not restore his memories. He read Barbara's words, the account of their journey across the country, but the events remained a story about someone else, a little boy named Ethan. He felt a profound sense of sympathy for the woman who had taken him, a woman who was clearly in immense pain, but he also felt a deep, abiding anger for the life that had been stolen from him, for the family he had grown up without. Chloe found herself in the unexpected role of family historian, the bridge between Ethan's lost past and his present. She spent hours with him, both in person and on the phone, sharing the memories that he couldn't access. She told him about their secret handshake, about the treehouse their father had built for them, about his favorite bedtime story. Each story was a small, fragile thread, weaving together the tapestry of a shared childhood, a tapestry that had been violently torn apart. One of the most powerful connections they discovered was a shared love of music. Chloe remembered that Ethan, as a little boy, had been obsessed with a particular lullaby their mother used to sing to them. It was an old, obscure folk song that had been passed down through their family. On a whim, Chloe hummed the melody to him over the phone. Ethan was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He knew the song. It had been a hum, he said, a melody that had floated in the back of his mind his entire life, a comforting sound with no known origin. This small shared memory was a breakthrough, the first piece of his past that felt like his own. It was a sensory connection, a ghost of a sound that had survived the trauma and the years of silence. It was a powerful reminder that while memories can be buried, the emotional imprint of love and comfort can endure. For Ethan, it was a single, solid piece of ground in the shifting landscape of his identity, a proof that the little boy from Oakhaven was still a part of him. The family decided to take a trip back to Oakhaven together. It was a difficult decision, especially for Ethan, who had no conscious memory of the town, but they knew it was a necessary step, a way to reclaim the physical spaces that had been defined by loss for so long. They walked the quiet streets, visited the park where the vigil had been held, and stood before the elementary school Ethan would have attended. For Sarah and Mark, it was a journey through a landscape of ghosts, but for the first time, they were not walking it alone. The most difficult part of the journey was visiting their old home. The new owners, aware of the story, were gracious and understanding, allowing them to walk through the house and the backyard. Standing by the ancient oak tree, the place where their lives had irrevocably changed, was a moment of profound and painful significance. Chloe described the game of hide-and-seek, her voice soft and steady, not with the guilt of a child, but with the sadness of an adult who understood the cruel randomness of fate. Ethan stood at the edge of the woods, the place where his old life had ended and his new one had begun. He felt no fear, only a strange sense of detachment, as if watching a scene from a movie. He could not remember the feeling of the grass under his feet or the sound of his sister's voice counting. But as he stood there, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees, he felt a sense of peace, a feeling of closing a circle that had been open for far too long. The journey was not a magical cure. It did not restore Ethan's memories or erase the years of pain, but it was a beginning. It was a way of building a new bridge, a bridge of shared stories and new experiences across the chasm that had separated them. They were no longer defined solely by their tragedy, but by their resilience, by their ability to find their way back to each other across a vast and silent distance. As they left Oakhaven, Ethan looked back at the small blue house, the place of his birth and his disappearance. He was not the same man who had arrived a few days earlier. He was still Daniel Jordan, the social worker from Philadelphia, but he was also, now, undeniably, Ethan Miller. He carried the stories and the love of a family he was just beginning to know. The bridge of memories was still under construction, but for the first time in his life, he could see the other side. The aftermath of the reunion and the discovery of the truth was not a fairy tale ending, but the beginning of a new, complex reality. The Miller family, now whole in a way they had not been for 22 years, had to learn how to be a family again. The dynamics had shifted, the roles had changed. Sarah and Mark were no longer just the grieving parents of a lost child. They were the parents of a grown man they barely knew, and Ethan was not a child to be coddled, but an adult with his own life, his own history, and his own family in the Jordans, who remained a vital and loving part of his life. The media attention, which had flared up with the news of the reunion, eventually subsided, leaving the family in the quiet and often awkward space of getting to know one another. There were family dinners that felt like first dates, phone calls filled with hesitant questions and careful answers. They were navigating a minefield of unspoken expectations and years of unshared experiences. The ghost of what they had lost was a constant presence at the table, a reminder of the life they should have had together. Chloe and Ethan's relationship continued to be the strongest bridge. They found in each other an easy camaraderie, a shared sense of humor that transcended the years of separation. Chloe's wedding, which had been the catalyst for their reunion, became a celebration not just of her future, but of their family's second chance. As Ethan walked her down the aisle alongside their father, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. It was a powerful symbol of their journey, of a brother returned to his sister's side. Ethan made the difficult decision to remain in Philadelphia. His life was there, his career, his friends, his adoptive parents. Uprooting himself to move to Oregon would be like losing another life, another identity. The Millers understood, though it was a painful acknowledgement of the reality of their situation. They couldn't get back the years they had lost, and they couldn't erase the life Ethan had built without them. Instead, they committed to a future of frequent visits, of creating new memories to fill the void of the old ones. Sarah found a new purpose. After years of being defined by her grief, she became a passionate advocate for missing children and their families. She shared their story, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the power of hope and the importance of never giving up. She volunteered with organizations that helped families navigate the labyrinth of a missing persons investigation, her own experience a beacon of light in their darkest hours. She had found a way to transform her pain into a force for good. Mark, a man who had always expressed his love through action rather than words, found his own way to connect with his son. He discovered that Ethan had a passion for woodworking, a hobby he had picked up from his adoptive father. Mark, a skilled carpenter, began to share his knowledge, sending Ethan blueprints and rare pieces of wood, and spending hours on video calls, discussing their projects. It was their own language, a way of building something new and beautiful together. The journey was not without its challenges. There were moments of frustration, of sadness for the milestones missed, the birthdays and holidays that could never be reclaimed. Ethan sometimes felt like an outsider in his own family, a visitor in a life that should have been his, and the Millers had to learn to love the man he was, not just the memory of the little boy they had lost. It was a process of constant negotiation, of letting go of the ghosts of the past to make room for the reality of the present. The story of Ethan Miller became a case study in the complexities of trauma, reunion, and identity. Psychologists and social workers were fascinated by his ability to have lived a full and happy life, despite the unknown trauma of his early years. His resilience was a testament to the love and stability provided by his adoptive parents. Jordan's story highlighted the profound truth that family is not just about blood, but about love, commitment, and the quiet, everyday acts of care. One day, about a year after their reunion, Ethan received a package from Chloe. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden box. When he opened it, he found a single, polished stone from the creek behind their old house in Oakhaven, and a framed photograph of the two of them, taken at Chloe's wedding. They were standing side by side, their smiles almost identical, their eyes sharing a knowledge that no one else could ever understand. It was a symbol of their past, their present, and their future. The future for the Miller family remained unwritten. There would be more challenges, more moments of sadness, more awkward silences. But there would also be more laughter, more shared stories, more new memories. They had been given a second chance, a rare and precious gift. The silence that had defined their lives for so long had been replaced by the sounds of a family learning to be whole again. The game of hide-and-seek was finally, truly over. And what they had found was more complex, more painful, and more beautiful than they could have ever imagined. 2 years after their reunion, the rhythms of the Miller family's new life had found a gentle, steady beat. The cross-country flights became a familiar routine, the video calls a daily ritual. The initial awkwardness had softened into a comfortable intimacy. The silences now filled with the easy understanding of shared history, both old and new. They were no longer just a collection of broken pieces, but a mosaic, the cracks filled with the gold of their resilience and their hard-won love. Ethan, in a move that surprised everyone, including himself, began to formally integrate his two identities. He legally changed his name to Ethan Daniel Miller Jordan, a hyphenated acknowledgement of the two families that had shaped him, the two lives that were now one. It was a public declaration that he was not leaving one life behind for another, but embracing the totality of his incredible journey. It was a name that told a story of loss, of love, of rediscovery. He and his fiancée, a woman who had stood by him through the emotional whirlwind of his reunion, decided to get married in a place that held meaning for both of his lives. A beautiful, historic, inn halfway between Philadelphia and Oakhaven, a symbolic meeting point. Both the Millers and the Jordans stood with him at the altar, a powerful image of his two families united. It was a day not of sorrow for what was lost, but of profound gratitude for what had been found. Sarah and Mark sold the small blue house in Oakhaven. The decision was a difficult one, a letting go of the last physical tie to their old life of grief. But it was also a liberation. They bought a smaller home, a place with no ghosts in the closets, no silent, menacing woods in the backyard. It was a home for their future, not their past. A place where they could build new memories with their son and his growing family. Chloe, now an aunt to Ethan's first child, a beautiful baby girl named Lily, found a new sense of peace. The guilt she had carried for so long had finally been lifted, replaced by a deep and abiding love for her brother and his family. She saw in Lily's eyes the same hazel shade as her own and her brother's, a beautiful, unbroken thread of connection that stretched across generations. The story of their family, she knew, would not be defined by the tragedy, but by their ability to overcome it. The case of Ethan Miller, though solved, left a lasting legacy. It led to changes in the way missing children's cases were handled, with a new emphasis on interstate cooperation and the use of advanced DNA technology. The what-ifs of his case, the near-misses, and the bureaucratic failures, served as a powerful lesson, ensuring that other families might not have to endure the same long, silent years of not knowing. His story, born of a personal tragedy, had become a catalyst for systemic change. Ethan never regained his memories of his first 8 years of life. They remained a closed book, a silent chapter, but he came to accept that. He realized that his identity was not just the sum of his memories, but the product of his experiences, his relationships, his choices, He had lived a good life as Daniel Jordan, and he would continue to live a good life as Ethan Miller Jordan. The past was a part of his story, but it was not the whole story. One evening, while putting his daughter to sleep, Ethan found himself humming a familiar tune. It was the lullaby, the ghost of a sound that had connected him to a past he couldn't remember. He sang the words that Chloe had retaught him, his voice soft in the quiet room. As Lily drifted off to sleep, her small hand clutching his finger, he felt a sense of profound and perfect peace. He was a son, a brother, a husband, a father. He was home. The story of the brother who vanished while playing hide-and-seek did not end, as the title might suggest, simply with where he was found. The here was not a geographical location, not a dusty attic in Trenton, or a quiet apartment in Philadelphia. The here was a place and time, a moment of healing, a state of being. It was in the laughter of his parents as they played with their granddaughter, in the warmth of his sister's embrace, in the love he felt for his own family. The silence that had once been a deafening roar in the Miller family was now filled with the music of an ordinary life, a life that was all the more precious for having been almost lost forever. The empty space at the dinner table was filled, the unanswered questions had been laid to rest, and the name Ethan, once a whispered prayer of grief, was now spoken with joy, with love, with the simple, beautiful sound of a family made whole.